asked yourself what the Middle East really is? Is it a continent, a region, or just a term introduced by the West for massive propaganda? Well, the Middle East is not a continent and technically is a part of the African continent. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen, Oman, Egypt, and Libya are known as the Middle East. Yet, if you see the map, you will see they appear to be a part of Africa. That's when things get quite suspicious. If the Middle East is a part of Africa, why was a distinction created between the same countries? What's the West-led propaganda aimed at creating differences between African countries and the countries in the Middle East that are rich in oil? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will expose how the Middle East was stolen from Africa and who benefited from it. Let's get started. The story of how the Middle East was once part of Africa and later disconnected includes manipulations that reshaped maps, history, and cultures, creating artificial divisions between Africa and the oil-rich nations of the Middle East. These divisions have made it difficult for African countries to connect with potential allies in the Middle East, allies that could help promote mutual growth. Arguments like these support that the Middle East has been part of Africa and will remain for those who know the reality. In historical texts like From Babylon to Timbuktu, there is detailed information on how the concept of the Middle East was carved out of Africa and how this separation was maintained through the use of propaganda. In the book, From Babylon to Timbuktu, the author argues that the modern map of Africa, which separates the Middle East as a distinct region, is a result of deliberate manipulation. That's because ancient historians like Herodotus described lands we now consider the Middle East as part of Northeast Africa. Herodotus noted that North Africa, including areas like Libya and Egypt, was inhabited by indigenous African peoples, debunking the idea that these regions were always culturally separate from the African continent. But things don't stop here. Before the construction of the Suez Canal, ancient maps showed Africa extending much farther north. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which today mark the borders of Iraq and parts of Turkey and Syria, were once considered part of Africa's northeastern boundary. The construction of the Suez Canal in the mid-19th century effectively disconnected Africa from these northeastern territories, preparing the separation of the African and Middle Eastern identities that persist today. That's because the West wanted to use the Suez Canal for its benefits, and this was not possible without disconnecting Egypt from the powerful countries of the Middle East. This was done by creating a new geopolitical entity, the Middle East, which furthered their control over trade routes, resources, and political alliances. The canal played a critical role in dividing Africa's unity, framing this new region as separate for the benefit of Western interests. Even if Egypt is considered part of Africa by the West's mainstream authors and narrative builders, tremendous attention is paid to creating differences between Egypt and broader Africa. Through films and distorted documentaries, the idea that Egyptians were not black is presented and spread, making people doubtful about whether Egypt should be considered African or not. However, various books talk about Hamites, who were ancient people historically recognized as black Africans, including the Egyptians. This understanding remained until the greatness of ancient African civilizations, such as Egypt and Kush. However, later, historians and anthropologists began to distance the Egyptians from the broader African history. By revising their classifications, they sought to cut off the link between these powerful African civilizations and the rest of the continent. This was done by making the burial sites in Egypt limited only to Western anthropologists and Egyptianologists. And they interpreted the found record however they wanted. However, the well-preserved paintings on the walls of various burial sites reveal black Egyptians in ancient times, rejecting the propaganda. But things get more complex and naked here. The book, From Babylon to Timbuktu, argues that this revisionist history served a political purpose. It reinforced European colonial ambitions to dominate African lands, while stripping Africans of their rightful claim to these ancient achievements. By distancing Egypt from Africa, European powers could justify their exploitation of the continent, portraying Africa as a place in need of civilization, rather than a land that had already achieved great cultural and scientific advancements. On page 106 of From Babylon to Timbuktu, the author highlights the forgotten cultural connections between Africa and the Middle East, particularly through the Phoenicians. The language of the Phoenicians, Hebrew, was spoken in regions of North Africa for centuries before the arrival of the Israelites. You should know that the Phoenicians were black people who controlled Mediterranean trade routes and established cities such as Carthage in present-day Tunisia. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. This trade network tied Africa to Asia and Europe, further challenging the modern notion that the regions of North Africa and the Middle East were always distinct. The historical record suggests a much greater level of cultural and economic integration between Africa and what is now considered the Middle East than is acknowledged today. These connections were gradually erased or diminished as colonial powers redrew borders and imposed new narratives. However, if we explore the relationship between Africa and what's considered the Middle East today, we get even religious and biblical backing. The story of Menelik Thermer, the legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, plays a key role in reinforcing the deep historical ties between Africa and the Middle East. Ethiopian tradition holds that Menelik I was the son of the Queen of Sheba and the King of Israel, King Solomon. He traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father and returned to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. This story creates a historical and religious link between Africa and Israel, suggesting that these regions were once part of a unified cultural and religious space. If they were disconnected, the Queen of Sheba would never travel to Israel to meet King Solomon. This shows that Israel was part of Africa, and travels of royal members took place often. Biblical history also points to African influence in the land of Canaan, which was inhabited and ruled by African descendants. Canaan himself, according to the Bible, was the son of Ham, the progenitor of many African peoples. The Bible describes Canaan as extending from Sidon, modern-day Lebanon, to Gaza, a region under African influence for centuries. Key biblical figures like Abraham traveled freely between Egypt and Canaan, reinforcing the deep cultural and economic connections between these regions. The story of Hagar, an Egyptian woman who became Abraham's wife for a decade, further cements the African roots of Canaan's people. Unfortunately, these connections are often ignored in modern narratives that seek to separate the African identity from these lands, reshaping history through a Eurocentric lens. But why was the Middle East stolen from Africa? Well, this propaganda played a key role in maintaining the division between Africa and the Middle East, especially as oil wealth began to concentrate in Middle Eastern countries during the 20th century. By portraying these nations as separate from Africa, Western powers successfully weakened the potential for a united front that could lead to mutual growth and resist foreign exploitation. Today, this new narrative often separates Africa, a continent that is portrayed as in need of aid and development, from the Middle East, which is viewed as resource-rich but politically unstable.